This is the Italian Real Estate Podcast, here to help you with the ins and outs and basics of Italian real estate, presented by ItalianRealEstateLawyers.com. Hello there, and welcome back to the Italian Real Estate Podcast, presented by ItalianRealEstateLawyers.com. Of course, we are back at it again with the one and only Marco Permunian, Italian attorney. How are you doing, man?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. Today, we wanted to get into the topic of property taxes. We've touched on it in the past. We've told you a little bit about how certain things work. We've also done an episode on the 7% flat tax that somebody might be able to expect if they're thinking about moving to Italy. And we wanted to get a little bit more into specifically an episode on taxes. So, Marco, I'm going to leave this one on your shoulders. Where should we get started with this topic?
When purchasing a house in Italy, you have to take into consideration two types of taxes. The very first one would be the registration tax. That would be a one-time tax that you pay at the time of the purchase, but as we will see in a second, the amount changes depending on the situation. And it could be very low or much higher depending on a few factors. The second type of tax that you have to keep in mind when purchasing a house in Italy, it would be the annual taxes that you pay twice a year just because you are the owner of the property, but not always. So you do not have to pay the annual taxes if some specific circumstances apply to your case. But let's start from the first tax, which would be the one-time tax that you pay at the time of the purchase. That's called registration tax or imposta di registro in Italian. And that's basically a tax that you pay and it is calculated based on the value on paper or fiscal value of the property. So it's not actually the calculated on the purchase price, but it's calculated on the value that the Italian government gives to that specific property, which could be higher or lower than the purchase price. Now, a non-resident private individual would end up paying the 9% calculated again on the value on paper of the property, unless that individual declares at the time of the purchase that it is his or her intention to relocate into the property, so move their residency from a legal standpoint, which means registering as a resident at that address with the town hall. And if you intend to do so within 18 months from the purchase, then you are responsible for paying a much lower amount, which would be the 2%. Now, what happens if you end up not moving your residency address there in the property that you're purchasing? You would have to pay the difference between the 9% and the 2%. And also, that only applies if it's your first house that you're buying in Italy. So if that's a vacation home and you already have another house, which is your primary residency, this tax discount cannot be applied to you. There is also another instance where this tax discount, which is called beneficio prima casa in Italian, can apply to you, and that would be if you are an Italian citizen who resides abroad and at the time of the purchase and is purchasing their first home in Italy. In that case, the requirement that I just mentioned, meaning moving your residency into the house, doesn't apply anymore because the Italian government allows Italian citizens who are registered as citizens of Italy residing abroad, meaning registered with the AIRE, and I think we recorded a few episodes about the AIRE, or at least we touched on that subject in a few instances. But if you are an Italian citizen registered with the AIRE, if you buy your first home in Italy and at the time of the purchase you are registered with the AIRE, you only pay the 2%. Now, that applies to transactions between private individuals. So if there's a seller who's a private individual who's selling to another private individual. But what if you're purchasing from a developer? So a company that built the house. In that case, the registration tax doesn't apply anymore because another tax applies, which needs to be paid at the time of the purchase. That would be the VAT, value added tax. But again, there's a difference depending on whether that's your first home or your secondary home. If it's your first home, then the amount that you have to pay is the 4%. If it's your second home, then the amount that you have to pay is the 10%. But the tax benefit that I just described, meaning the lower amount of taxes that you pay if it's your first home, doesn't apply if that home that you're buying is a luxury property. And there is a law in Italy that defines which properties are to be considered as luxury houses, such as palaces or castles. But let's talk about annual taxes. So the second type of tax that I referred to at the beginning of the episode, the annual property taxes in Italy are known as IMU. The amount of those taxes depends on the specific municipality where the house is located. So there is a different amount depending on where the house is, and it's defined by basically the municipality where the house is located. So it's not possible to give just a general idea of what those taxes can be in Italy, but the amount is normally relatively low unless it's a luxury property. Now, when are these taxes due? They're due twice a year, in June and in December. Also, if there are multiple owners, co-owners of the property, each owner is responsible to pay their share. So it's not possible for one owner to cover somebody else's share, including the situation where two spouses co-own the property if both the names are on the title. And the annual taxes are calculated based on the time period starting from which you started to own the property. So if you bought your property in March, you have to divide the annual taxes into 12 months, and then you would pay only from month number 4 to month number 12. So that's how you calculated the annual taxes in Italy.
This has been really interesting to hear about how all of this works and what's taken into consideration. But you did briefly mention before about, if I'm not mistaken, if it's your primary residency. So would you be able to maybe go into a little bit more? What are the differences between if a place is your primary residency or if it's not your primary residency? And then also, is it something considered your primary residency if you only have one residence in Italy, but you live in another country? How does this all work, and what are the differences there?
If what you're buying is your first home in Italy, you don't have to pay annual taxes. So there is a tax discount, not only at the time of the purchase, but also when it comes to paying annual taxes, where the annual taxes, if it's your first home in Italy, and if it's not a luxury property, are equal to 0. So you don't pay any annual taxes. But once again, only on the condition that that's your one and only home in Italy. And of course, it doesn't matter if you have other homes abroad, as long as you only have one in Italy. But if you're buying your second home in Italy because you already have one, then you will only not pay annual taxes on your first house that you purchased, but you will have to pay them regarding your second house that you purchased. But once again, for luxury properties, this tax discount doesn't apply.
Well, thank you so much for clarifying that and getting into even a bit more detail. But of course, before we end off this episode, if anybody is needing help to purchase a home, maybe even their first home in Italy or their second home, how can they get in contact with you and your team?
People can send us a message through our website, ItalianRealEstateLawyers.com. People can also call us. The number is on the website.
Absolutely fantastic. And of course, if you're interested in more content like this about Italian real estate, be sure that you subscribe to both the YouTube channel as well as the audio-only podcast on your favorite podcasting player of choice. But of course, the benefit to being subscribed on YouTube is that you also are automatically subscribed to the Italian Citizenship Podcast, another project that Marco and I also collaborate on, where we talk about actually the legal aspects of remaining in Italy, becoming a citizen of Italy, becoming a resident of Italy, how some of these different things work. And also, if you're interested in more content about life abroad, living abroad as an Italian dual citizen expat, be sure to come over and check out my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Rafael Di Furia, where I get into some of these topics and talk about some of the practical aspects of what it's like from a personal perspective, and comparing and contrasting and showing a little bit of the areas where I live, as well as getting out and about and showing you some of Italy as well. But of course, Marco, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about these things and shed some more light on these subjects to do with purchasing Italian property. Of course, also, I'm Rafael Di Furia. Stay safe and healthy out there. This, of course, has been another episode of the Italian Real Estate Podcast, brought to you by ItalianRealEstateLawyers.com. See y'all next time. Later.
Thank you.